And thank you to everyone who's taken the time to join us online. I'm going to attempt to do something quite tricky, which is to cover the story of the Navy in New Zealand waters from Cook to the present. And that's a big ask, and it necessarily takes a fair number of slides. I'll go through them at a good clip because I don't want to bore people with any one of them. And I am aware that no one could possibly cover every facet of the story of the RNZN, let alone the entire story of New Zealand naval history in one PowerPoint. So if there's something that is missed out, then I apologize in advance. But let's make a start. And I make a start at the most obvious place, which is, of course, with James Cook, Lieutenant James Cook in Bark Endeavour, first known European contact since Abel Tasman in 1642. And of course, the first time that the RN was in contact with these waters. There was a clash of cultures, and of course, we've heard a great deal in recent years about the tragedies that occurred. There were 9 Maori who died on first contact, and that's a tragedy, of course. But see it from Cook's point of view, he was a seaman, an explorer, a cartographer, but he was also responsible for his crew of sailors and Royal Marines. And he was faced with Maori who, at one point, seemed to want to seize his floating island and challenged him. What was he going to do? Obviously, not take too many risks, and he opened fire to protect his men and his ship and his mission. That's the way things were. He achieved an enormous amount with his chronometer, his compass, the sextant, the telescope, the lead line. Those were the simple technologies of his day, by far the most important, of course, being Harrison's chronometer, by which he was able to establish longitude. It was, by our standards, a very hit and miss business, and he achieved extraordinary results. Some of his charts didn't need updating again until the 20th century, and some of them were found to be perfectly accurate 100 and 200 years after he'd used them. One of the other early visitors to New Zealand, calling in at the Bay of Islands, was the young Charles Darwin, under the command of Lieutenant Robert Fitzroy, Royal Navy. And the Beagle sailed with 10 officers, 4 mids, 38 seamen, boys, 8 Marines, and 8 supernumeraries, including him, which just goes to show that sometimes the least important person on board turns out to be the one who's going to influence history in a way that no one could have predicted. There came a point in the story of New Zealand and the Crown when it was obvious that something had to happen, because people were turning up in New Zealand wanting land. And of course, there was no means by which it could be legally transferred. All sorts of abuses were taking place. People were losing their lives. Sealers and whalers and other ne'er-do-wells were washing up at Kororareka, now Russell in the Bay of Islands. And there was no lawful authority. The resident James Busby and the Maori chiefs who were noting all this were crying out for assistance. And of course, if you want a job done, you send a naval officer, and the Colonial Office and the Crown sent Captain William Hobson, who was a very competent negotiator and a good person for the job. Unfortunately, he was carrying within him tuberculosis, which was to kill him very shortly after he arrived in New Zealand, within 2 years. But he was instrumental in getting the agreement of very large numbers of Maori chiefs to sign on behalf of their tribes the Treaty of Waitangi. Now, of course, as we know, in recent years, there has been a great deal of dispute as to what exactly the treaty says and what was intended. Certainly, the English language version ceded sovereignty of New Zealand to the Crown. The Maori translation was less clear as to what exactly sovereignty was. Many people suggested that the Maoris thought that they were giving the shadow of the land to Queen Victoria while keeping the substance of the land for themselves. That's not quite how the Crown saw it or how it worked in practice. The next naval officer there was Captain Royal Navy Robert Fitzroy, Beagle's old captain. He came and he tried to protect the Maori from illegal land sales, but he wasn't successful because the New Zealand Company under Edward Gibbon Wakefield were determined that land would be made available under the Wakefield scheme to those who were seeking it. And the land, of course, was already owned by Maori, and all kinds of different deals were done in order to negotiate it out of the hands of the Maori and into the hands of the Europeans who arrived with land in mind. So in order to get rid of Fitzroy, the Wakefield and his New Zealand company demanded he was recalled to the colonial office, and so he was. Warfare broke out in the north, and troops were sent ashore to try to deal with it. They completely underestimated the capability of the Maori, who by this stage had acquired muskets. Indeed, there'd been a musket war at the turn of the 19th century. And soldiers, sailors, and Marines from North Star and Hazard marched inland and sought to defeat Hone Heki, who was regularly chopping down the flagstaff at Kororareka, and they took terrible punishment. There are the last moments of Lieutenant George Philpott's Royal Navy of HMS Hazard during the storming of Apar in Northland. And the battle established, if there was ever any doubt about it, that a frontal assault on a Maori pa by British troops was not a good idea. As you can see there in the illustration, they're well protected and more than capable of taking on the same muskets being used by British soldiers and sailors on the other side. The steam corvette Orpheus was a tragic tale. She was coming into Manukau Harbour, which is on the west coast, instead of going round to Auckland Harbour, which is a safe port to enter. Manukau is beset with sandbars. Commodore Burnett, bringing Orpheus in, had an 1853 edition of the chart that he needed. There was a later 1861 version which showed the sandbar in a completely different position. And Orpheus struck the sandbar, and over the course of a day, the ship sank into the sand, men climbed into the rigging, the mast collapsed, rescuers arrived too late, and 189 of the crew of 259 died, many of them being boys, some of them being Australians. It remains New Zealand's worst maritime disaster. I've been involved as a young officer in the RNZN with helping to place a plaque at the nearest point to where this tragedy occurred. In the land wars of the 1860s, further south in the North Island, once again, sailors were used where soldiers weren't available, and they were used in Taranaki on the Waikato and in Tauranga to attack Maori pa with heavy loss of sailors and officers' lives. Once again, an underestimation of the capability of well-led Maori to resist attack in a frontal assault. And if it hadn't been for the assistance of friendly Maori tribes, it's hard to know how these battles would have ended up. Without sea and river transportation, British troops really could not have subdued the Maori rebellion, if that's the correct word, against the Crown in the 1860s. It would have taken much longer. It was a riverine war on the Waikato. And of course, in order to get to the extreme parts of New Zealand, like the Taranaki area, that was all done by sea. There was no internal transport in those days. Calliope Dock was opened in 1885. It was very much a Royal Navy venture. The Admiralty wanted places where ships could be repaired in the Southern Hemisphere, and it became a most important facility, many times extended, many times refitted, but still exactly where it was when HMS Calliope sailed in 1885 to initiate. You can see the two ships there at that time. Calliope goes on to be a famous ship. She was sent to observe what was going on with the Americans and the Germans in Apia Harbor. A cyclone came through, and the only ship that escaped without damage, sinking, or being beached was HMS Calliope. She had a single screw, and she had on board high igneous, high quality New Zealand coal from Westport. And with her single screw, she came up on both her anchors and then lifted the anchors at the last moment and managed to get through a gap in the reef and out into open water. And there you see an image from the London Illustrated News of American officers cheering Calliope as she makes her way out through the breach in the barrier. Whether that really happened, I rather doubt. I can't imagine too many Americans cheering a ship on as she escaped while they were dashed ashore. However, that's the story of the Calliope. Of course, there was never going to be any possibility in those days of having a fleet large enough to defend the urban centres of New Zealand from raiders from the sea. Every time Britain and Russia went to war over Afghanistan, New Zealanders took the view, as did Australians, that any time now a Russian raider would turn up and bombard the cities. As Andrew Lambert has pointed out, if that had ever happened, the Royal Navy would have gone into the Baltic and leveled St. Petersburg. So it was a pretty much a deterrent capability. Nevertheless, disappearing rampart guns were put into Australasian cities. And there's the one that looks out over the Waitemata Harbour there. You can see it's a state-of-the-art piece. The recoil from the firing drove the gun back into the gun pit for reloading, which meant that it was out of view for most of the time. A smart piece of technology. The other way of trying to defend harbours, of course, was through spar torpedo boats. Anyone who actually thinks about how this thing was supposed to work realized that it would have been a suicidal effort to have taken a spar torpedo up to a warship and prodded it with it to see if you could make a hole in the side of it. But that was the state of the art at the time. You see there a delightful old gentleman called Captain Commandant Leroy, and he commanded the Auckland Naval Division during that period. He got to that great age by being a man who insisted on temperance for all his ship's companies that he served in and with and commanded. I can't imagine that made him the most popular of officers, but as you can see, he got to a great age in uniform. The USN Great White Fleet visit of 1908 to Auckland was a signal event in New Zealand's naval history. The Admiralty were not in favour of it from either Australia or New Zealand ports, but they frankly had no ability to stop the New Zealand and Australian governments for inviting Teddy Roosevelt to send his 16 battleships to these ports. Something like 1 in 10 New Zealanders were waiting to see these ships come in. It was by far the most exciting thing that had happened for years, and there was an enormous amount of effort to make the Americans feel welcome. That wasn't just because of New Zealanders' natural hospitality. It was also because the British had just re-signed a treaty with the Japanese, taking the view that the Japanese were now very much British allies and that they would therefore do Royal Navy work in the Pacific in the event of war. In effect, that turned out to be true, but it didn't convince Australians or New Zealanders that the Japanese were a friendly force that wouldn't at some stage in the future cause problems in the Pacific. So prescient in the long run, and stars and stripes, if you please, protect us from the Japanese was one of the sayings of the time. My grandmother, who was a contralto and a pianist, sang on board the flagship for the officers in their wardroom and played the piano. And I remember talking to her about that when I was a young boy. The Royal Navy was not strongly represented in the Australasian station. The China fleet was a more powerful force, but tucked away down in Sydney was HMS Powerful, a 1895 protected cruiser. It was the only Aryan ship based permanently in Sydney, and it visited Auckland very occasionally. It was sent across for the arrival of the Great White Fleet, and there was very nearly a collision between it and one of the American battleships. Just as well that didn't happen. With this emphasis on the importance of protecting the South Pacific and Australia and New Zealand in particular, Australia, of course, buys its own battle cruiser, Indefatigable class battle cruiser, and brings it out as the flagship of the First Fleet unit. And New Zealand can't do that, but what it does instead is spends the money to get the Brits to buy themselves another battle cruiser. And of course, they had naming rights, so HMS New Zealand it becomes. Very few sailors on board were of New Zealand extraction, few officers, but not very many sailors. She comes out to visit New Zealand in 1913. And of course, famously, her first captain was Lionel Halsey, who goes on to much bigger things. And the Maori iwi, the tribe that came on board, presented him with the flax skirt or kilt, the piu-piu, and a Maori greenstone tiki. And with it went 3 prophecies: that the ship would be involved in sea battles, she would be hit, but only once, and that no one on board would be killed. Well, in 1913, that seemed a very improbable thing to be saying, but it all turned out to be true, as we shall see. You can see there that photograph, totally politically incorrect by the standards of today, of ship's company dressing themselves up and painting themselves as Maori. New Zealand troops occupied German Samoa at the request of the British government as soon as the war broke out. The New Zealand government got a signal saying, if you're interested in doing it, we would certainly value your going up and taking over German Samoa. That's what happened. HMAS Australia, that should read, went up there as the main ship, but Philomel went as well, the only local warship that the New Zealanders had. The commander was Captain Hall Thompson. And you can see there in the photograph the Union Jack having been just raised over the governor's residence in Samoa. Fortunately, there were no casualties. A level of common sense and civility resulted. And of course, New Zealanders took over the signal station, which was the point and purpose of going up there, to make sure that Germans weren't communicating with Graf Spee's fleet coming across the Pacific. HMS New Zealand was under fire at Jutland. She fired 450 shells at the German fleet. How many of them hit is a good question. There were 6,000 Royal Navy sailors killed at Jutland, most of them in the battle cruisers that blew up. New Zealand was a lucky ship. She wasn't hit in such a way that she was caused any casualties. As you're probably aware, HMAS Australia and HMS New Zealand collided in March of 1916. It was a brief encounter, but HMAS Australia came off second best, and she had to be away in Plymouth being refitted and only just got back to the North Sea after the battle had finished, a day or two later. That may have been a great piece of good fortune. No one can predict what might have happened if HMAS Australia had been hit in the same way that her sisters were and blew up with terrible loss of life. New Zealand was only hit the once during the action, as predicted, on X-turret. There were no casualties. Needless to say, the Captain Green, by then, was wearing his pew-pew, and he was wearing his tiki, and there were sailors on board to make sure he was. So there are the three battle cruisers that exploded, or I make mention there, Inflexible, Indefatigable, and Queen Mary. Their ammunition handling procedures were not adequate, and neither was the armored protection on their decks and particularly on their turrets. And David Beatty made the most famous understatement in naval history: there seemed to be something wrong with our bloody ships today when the third of them blew up. New Zealand wasn't just sitting around waiting for events. It was, of course, committed first of all to the Middle East and then to the Gallipoli campaign. And there were New Zealand hospital ships, Marama and Mahino, which were bought by the New Zealand people, not by the government, but by the people, and fully equipped and sent to war. And you can see there that bodies are being, or wounded men are being taken from the beaches of Gallipoli to Lemnos for nursing care, where there were New Zealand and Australian and British nurses waiting for them. There were 10 New Zealand Army nurses drowned on the hospital ship Marquette, which was a British ship, when it was torpedoed by a German submarine in the Mediterranean in October 1915. 128 British soldiers lost their lives as well. Tragedy stalked the whole of the Gallipoli campaign from start to finish. There was a young New Zealander called William Sanders who tried to join up in New Zealand but was told he wasn't suitable, and he made his own way to Britain and joined the Royal Navy Reserve. And his mission became to command a topsail schooner, HMS Prize, taken from the Germans. She was known as a Q ship. The job was to be a tempting target for U-boats, which would decide not to waste a torpedo on an old sailing ship and would surface, at which point it would be possible to blast her out of the water with hidden guns. In order to complete the ruse, a panic party would leave the ship, making it appear as though she was now unmanned. And that's precisely what happened the first time that Prize was successful. And this was an amazing piece of bravery and nerve, holding on and waiting until the German submarine was in range while enduring a bombardment from her deck gun. And Sanders was given a VC for that. The second time he got away with it, he got a DSO. What he didn't realize is that he hadn't actually sunk the U-boat, which got back and reported what had happened. And the next time a U-boat fell in with prize, they knew very well what to do, which was to remain submerged and to torpedo prize. And she was lost with Sanders and all hands. That's a New Zealand naval VC, albeit not an RNZN VC, but a VC for a New Zealand officer nevertheless. Count Felix von Luckner, one of the great characters of the First World War, sailed through the blockade as a Norwegian timber trader in 1916, and then got down onto the Atlantic and started sinking British ships. He was a sailing ship, as you can see, Zeeadler, and therefore did not arouse much suspicion when he came close to British merchant ships until it was too late. He sank 15 ships in 225 days without causing loss of British life. He decided to escape from the Atlantic, where his antics were becoming well known, round into the Pacific, and there his ship was wrecked, and he managed to get some help for some of his men, but eventually they were all captured and taken to Auckland, to Motuhi Island. His first effort at escape was quite remarkable. The Germans put on a concert for the governor and all the ship's company, and one by one they all sneaked away until there was just one person left to take the curtain call. They stole the governor's boat, cut the cable back to Auckland, and got away in it. He was, of course, needless to say, recaptured and eventually repatriated to Germany in 1919. Philomel had had quite an active war, but by 1917, her time as a seagoing warship was up, and there was a need to have a permanent naval vessel moored first in Wellington, then later in Auckland. Philomel came alongside for the last time as the depot ship and became home to generations of new entrants into the Navy. Her name came ashore, and she became the shore establishment we still know, HMNZS Philomel, in due course. Philomel, as you can see, has a badge which shows the goddess Philomena. There have been efforts over the years by sailors to turn her into a Maori maiden, and none of those have succeeded, and tradition has prevailed. She was a Pearl-class cruiser built in 1889, and her time was up by the time she came alongside. Her engines were removed and her guns taken off, and she became home to a lot of sailors for a very long time. The surrender of the German High Seas Fleet in 1918 is the greatest victory the Royal Navy has ever achieved. And of course, it was done without a single shot being fired, but it was done as the direct result of the inability of the German battle fleet to break out of the North Sea. And the time came when there was a mutiny amongst the Kriegsmarine, and the fleet was effectively no longer a warlike proposition. They sailed into captivity in Scapa Flow. HMAS Australia was there, so was HMS New Zealand as one of the escorting battle cruisers, bringing the German ships into captivity. And you can see there the surrender on board. Jellicoe, the fleet commander at Jutland, was sent to be the New Zealand Governor General, and he was also charged with the job of making sure that the future provision of the defense of the empire was undertaken. And he came out in HMS New Zealand, and he made the recommendation that there be 8 battle cruisers and 8 battleships permanently based in Singapore, that it become a major fleet base, and of course that New Zealand and Australia should have a fair representation of ships either on station or rotating through there. He recommended 6 submarines for New Zealand. None of these fanciful ideas, of course, ever came to pass. HMS New Zealand was a great success in touring around the country, but of course, all battle cruisers of her vintage were obsolete by 1919, and under the terms of the Naval Treaty at Washington, which required the reduction of the size of the Royal Navy, she and HMAS Australia were both scrapped. In the case of Australia, sunk off Sydney Heads. New Zealand governments continued to pay off the loan from British banks to buy New Zealand for a very long time to come. So we come to HMS Chatham, In 1921, she came out, an old coal burner, very similar. In fact, the name ship of the class for HMAS Sydney that took on the German raider off Cocos Island. Chatham arrived in 1920 and was the first of many RN cruisers which would serve in the RNZN until 65. Hood arrived in 1924 for the Empire cruise of the Special Service Squadron, very much intended as a reassurance to the Dominions and the Empire that the Royal Navy was still able to command the seas on which the trade routes of the Empire ran, and that it would be a guarantor of the safety of the seas as it had been in the 19th century. The world had moved on a little bit from then. Nevertheless, it was a great moment to have Hood in Auckland and later Wellington Harbour. Between the wars, the New Zealand division consisted mostly of 2 cruisers. It was supposed to be supplemented, if possible, by destroyers, but that never really happened. The 2 light cruisers, Diomede and Dunedin, came out. Dunedin stayed longest. Diomede was recalled. And of course, you have to remember that these ships are Royal Navy ships, with mostly Royal Navy ships companies on board stationed on the New Zealand station. So the Admiralty did have the right to say where these ships would go in the world. And if they could, they would be left in New Zealand waters. But in time of war, there was no doubt that they would revert to Admiralty control. There were 2 other small vessels, Laburnum and Veronica. And Veronica happened to be alongside at Napier when the earthquake struck on the 3rd of February 1931. It killed 256 people and injured many more. The nurses' home collapsed onto the nurses who were living there, and there were terrible scenes there. There were people wounded in the streets. It was really one of the worst events in New Zealand's civilian history. And of course, immediately Diomede and Dunedin were sailed from Auckland. They got there in about 48 hours. But the first ship to respond was, of course, Veronica, which was alongside. They were the first responders. They did an enormous amount to help. And of course, they became the place where medical staff went ashore from, and bakeries were flashed up so that bread was available. And they did what you'd expect the Navy to do, which is to do its utmost to provide care and succor in a time of crisis and emergency. The New Zealand Division of the Royal Navy was greatly enhanced and supplemented by the arrival of the 2 Leander-class light cruisers, Achilles and Leander, both laid down and completed in the early 30s and made available to the RAN and the RNZN. These Leanders, or the New Zealand Division of the Royal Navy, I should say still, these Leanders were very good ships, state-of-the-art for their day. They were fast, 32 knots. They were armed for destroying armed merchant cruisers with 6-inch guns. There were 8 built in all, Hobart, Sydney, and of course Perth. They were all 2-funnel ships, whereas Leander, Neptune, Orion, and Ajax were single-funnel ships. The amphibious Walrus, which they all flew in the days before radar, was known as a pusser's duck. More of it anon. When New Zealand went to war, and it did so on the 3rd of September 1939, immediately after Chamberlain's announcement, Michael Joseph Savage, the New Zealand Prime Minister, said on the radio, "Both with gratitude for the past and with confidence in the future, we range ourselves without fear beside Britain. Where she goes, where she stands, we stand. Where she goes, we go. We are only a small and young nation, but we march forward with a union of hearts and wills to a common destiny." And of course, immediately there was an Admiralty signal to all ships at home and abroad, commence hostilities with Germany. And that, of course, meant that the Admiralty had command of where in the world Achilles and Leander were to go. And the answer was that Achilles was destined for the West Indies, but halfway there, she was diverted to go round Cape Horn and to join Henry Harwood, who was searching for a pocket battleship known to be in the South Atlantic. And it was, of course, the Admiral Graf Spee, though no one was quite sure which of the 2 pocket battleships, Scheer or Spee, it was. She was pre-positioned in 1939, before the war started, to sink British merchant ships when war commenced, and her job was to avoid being engaged by the Royal Navy. Her job was not to be involved in naval action, but to do as raiders always do, to destroy commerce and to deprive raw materials from getting to where they were needed. Graf Spee sank 8 merchant ships between September and December 39. There are the opening salvos of the battle from Achilles and Ajax. Both of them together didn't have the firepower of, in terms of range, of Graf Spee. And there's Achilles in action firing 6-inch broadsides. Commodore Harwood had planned to divide Graf Spee's fire, or the Admiral Scheer's fire, whichever ship it was, because, of course, she only had 2 turrets with triple 11-inch guns. So she could either be firing all her armament at 1 ship or at 2 ships, but not at 3, which gave 1 ship a chance to get in underneath the range of the 11-inch guns and do what it could to create havoc. The New Zealand national flag went into action at sea for the first time in this battle. Achilles' signalman, who was a New Zealander, asked Parry if he could fly the New Zealand flag. Parry immediately agreed, said to find the largest New Zealand flag and largest New Zealand ensign and fly it from the mainmast. And there's Captain Parry on his bridge. He was wounded in both legs by shrapnel. He never left his bridge while the ship was in action. Exeter, of course, was the ship that had the bigger guns, 8-inch guns, and a longer range, but still not long enough to get into a hit Graf Spee unless she closed the range beyond the point at which she could be hit. And that's exactly what happened. She closed the range, but paid a very high price. And as you can see there, she was taking terrible damage. And Harwood in Ajax decided he couldn't stand off any longer. He closed the range, divided enemy fire as intended, and of course, prevented Exeter being sunk with total loss of life. It's arguable that Harwood stayed out of range too long himself and that Exeter took more punishment than she needed to. That's a matter for tacticians to debate. But the reality is that Exeter survived due to Ajax and Achilles going in like lightweights under the reach of the big heavyweight and hammering her as hard as they could for as long as they could. And indeed, they succeeded. Exeter's turrets were completely knocked out. Her steering was destroyed. Her captain, Hooky Bell, on the bridge of Exeter was the only man left unwounded up there. The after conning position was just about destroyed. He was steering by a boat's compass, and a bridge, the bridge orders, or his orders, were going down by shouted chain of men to the after rudder position so that the rudder could be moved by voice command. At one point, he reportedly said, "If he gives me half a chance, I intend to ram." It was a disaster for Exeter. 70 were dead. And one of her 8-inch hits on Graf Spee, it destroyed her fuel processing system, which severely limited Langsdorff's options. There were 23 hits in all and 36 German dead. So it was a fairly major effort by Achilles and Ajax to get in and put 6-inch shells into her, including wounding Langsdorff himself. Achilles was hit in the gunnery direction tower. There were 4 dead there. And one of the remainders, who was wounded, quickly grabbed one of the dead out of his chair and replaced him and kept up the rate of fire. A great example of why cross-training of people is such an important part of naval training and warfare. There you can see there's the transfer of Exeter's wounded and dead ashore at the Falkland Islands and funerals for some of Exeter's dead who still lie at Port Stanley. Waiting for the resumption of the battle after Graf Spee had entered Montevideo was a testing and worrying time. Exeter was gone. Ajax had lost her X and Y turret. The nearest Aryan battleships were at Gibraltar. The whole situation was fairly perilous, particularly as it was very difficult to know which of the many entrances out of the River Plate Graf Spee might attempt to make. The other problem was that each of the ships was down and low in ammunition stocks until Cumberland arrived, having come up at over 1,000 miles in less than 36 hours from Port Stanley, where she'd been doing a refit. A ruse convinced the Germans that the British were waiting for Graf Spee in numbers, that there were capital ships there. That may have been influential in Langsdorff's thinking, but more likely his realization that there was simply no way back to Germany what was he going to do after he got to sea with low on fuel and with no ability to make more. He really did the only thing he could. After a long struggle with my conscience, I've reached the grave decision to scuttle Graf Spee to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. I'm convinced that given the circumstances, this decision was the only one possible after having led my ship into the trap of Montevideo. That's what he wrote in his suicide note before he lay down on the ship's battle ensign and shot himself. I alone bear the responsibility for scuttling Graf Spee. I'm happy to pay with my life for any possible reflection on the honor of the flag. In recent times, that insignia has been raised from the bottom, and much discussion as to what exactly should happen to that large swastika. So that's Langsdorff's story. And of course, with great relief, Ajax, Achilles, and Cumberland sailed away. Congratulations. I cannot speak too highly of the conduct of the officers and ship's company of HMS Achilles. They carried out their duties under hot fire with complete unconcern. New Zealand has every reason to be proud of her seamen during their baptism of fire, so said Henry Harwood. And Graf Spee's gunnery officer described Achilles' rate of fire as fantastic, and Ajax's scout plane remarked how beautiful her firing was. 6-inch guns were still very manpower intensive, and you needed strong men inside to fire those guns, and really an Olympic standard of athleticism in retrospect. And they were attaining a fire rate of 9 rounds per gun per minute, a very impressive feat. Not all, of course, were striking home, but enough did. The welcome to Auckland was quite sensational, as you can see from the size of the crowds there. The population of Auckland turned out to welcome Achilles with a parade up Queen Street, a civic reception where an entire brewery had to be provided to slake the thirst of everyone who attended. HMS Ramillies, the British battleship, happened to be in Wellington at the time of the battle, and she flew a signal which read, "Well done, the Achilles," when news of the battle reached Wellington. So it was a major event in not just New Zealand naval history, but I would suggest in New Zealand history. Leander, meanwhile, was having a quieter war in the Indian Ocean, and then later it threw into the Mediterranean. In the Indian Ocean, she ordered an unflagged freighter to stop for an inspection off the Maldives and called for the identification signal, which, of course, the freighter couldn't provide. It immediately raised Italian colors and simultaneously engaged Leander with 5.9-inch guns. The shells went flying over Leander. Fortunately, Leander returned fire quickly and set her ablaze, but she was very close in. 2 Italians were killed and 100 were rescued. Now, if this bears any resemblance to what happens to Sydney, it's not coincidental. Leander, like Sydney, came far too close in. In the case of Ram 1, unlike Cormoran, she didn't succeed in hitting her bridge. It might have been a catastrophe on the same scale as Sydney's loss of 645 men and the ship off Geraldton. Leander was a lucky ship on this occasion. She was in the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and in 1941, with 2 RN destroyers, engaged 2 Italian destroyers. The British destroyers chased Francesco Nullo and sank her. So Leander wasn't directly involved in that battle, but she certainly had fired at the 2 Italians before rejoining the convoy she was escorting. The birth of a navy, the RNZN, changed from HMS to HMNZS on the 1st of October 1941. His Majesty approved the name change and the new prefix HMNZS. This was a recognition that the New Zealand government did have a right to say where in the world its ships and its men were deployed. They were paying for them after all. The ships were still mixed manned by both RN and RNZN. Achilles Ships Company, for example, of 560 plus, there were 5 officers and 316 ratings New Zealanders. But now the Admiralty had to ask the New Zealand government for the use of their ships on loan to New Zealand. It's the same way that the New Zealand division fighting in the desert was a crack unit that had to be asked for by the British government before it was deployed in action on many occasions. And the New Zealand government had the last say as to how its division was to be employed. The same thing applied to the Navy now. The Dominion Yachtsman Scheme, which many of you are very familiar with, was a scheme whereby the Royal Navy, which was desperately short of young men who had some idea as to how to take charge and hopefully with some knowledge of the sea or navigation, could be transferred to the RN to help fight and win the Battle of the Atlantic to begin with, and then all the wars and all the battles in which the Royal Navy was involved for the rest of the war. Some of these people went on to be very considerable naval characters. Peter Phipps, for example, a DSC and Bar, an amazing officer who went on to be a nationally important character and individual. It greatly expanded New Zealand's presence in the Royal Navy. And of course, many New Zealanders learned to fly before the war, something that not very many people around the world were doing, but it was important in New Zealand for agricultural purposes. And there was something like 600 Fleet Air Arm pilots and observers made available to the Royal Navy. At one stage, there was 60 pilots in the British Pacific Fleet, New Zealanders. They even asked rather cheekily if they could have a New Zealand silver fern in the curl on their sleeve. The Admiralty said, no, certainly not. 7,000 New Zealanders served on attachment to the RN, spread through British warships right around the world. But the Fleet Air Arm contribution was very significant. There was one interesting event that occurred. A young officer called Para Bennett, who was a Maori, passed his Fleet Air Arm flying training in the UK and therefore needed to be commissioned. But the Admiralty initially refused to do so because he was not of British stock. New Zealand Prime Minister Peter Fraser heard about this, called Winston Churchill, and the decision was very swiftly reversed. We're not going to have any of that. The Women's Royal New Zealand Naval Service came into existence on the 11th of April 1942, very much modelled on the British Wrens. There were nearly 650 women served in the Wrens during the Second World War across 21 different branches of naval service. And of course, there was also the Royal New Zealand Naval Nursing Service, and you can see the matron there in her very distinctive cap. They did great work, and their contribution shouldn't be forgotten, mainly in signalling, but also intelligence, watchkeeping, motor maintenance, driving, a whole lot of other trades as well. The coloured photograph there shows you Elizabeth House, which was where, after the war, the Wrens, when they were reinstituted, when it was realised they shouldn't have been got rid of, took up residence. There was Elizabeth House and Margaret House. And one of my duties as Officer of the Day at Philomel was to go around in the evening and check that everything was squared away at Elizabeth House. It was a very pleasant duty because the Officer of the Day was always greeted by Wrens who provided fruitcake and cups of tea. So it was no hardship at all to go around there and check with the Chief Petty Officer that everyone was tucked in for the night. The greatest tragedy in New Zealand's naval history occurred when HMS Neptune was lost in an Italian minefield off Tripoli in 1941. And I know we have on the line with us today people who have a deep involvement with the search for Neptune and Kandahar. And I thank for them for their continuing care for the descendants of these two ships lost in the Mediterranean. Neptune was going to be the next Leander-class cruiser to join Achilles and Leander on station in New Zealand. But unfortunately, a newly laid minefield off Libya claimed her. She ran into it, detonated one mine, and then was going so far she detonated a second. She was then stopped. Her rudders and propellers were badly damaged. She couldn't move. Ships came in, or at least one ship, Kandahar, came in to attempt to take off the ship's company. Then she detonated another mine, and she was immobilized and clearly sinking. And HMS Penelope, the cruiser, was planning to come in and tow Neptune back to Alexandria, but very bravely, Captain Rory O'Connor, who was a splendid officer, ordered keep clear. And that meant that when she touched off a fourth mine, the ship rolled over and sank within 5 minutes. Very few survived. Some were in the water, and they survived for a short space of time. But and Rory O'Connor was one of them, but they died after a few days in a Kali float. Only one individual got ashore and was taken as a POW by the Italians. Of the 764 officers and ratings on board, 150 were New Zealanders. That was a very heavy blow to New Zealand and the small RNZN. Rory O'Connor is one of those officers you feel sure would have gone on to greater things like Heck Waller and Emile Descheno, and done great things in the post-war Navy, but he was just unlucky. And of course, it left the RNZN now critically short of trained sailors, and that was to affect the way in which the RNZN was able to operate for the rest of the war. New Zealand and the Pacific War. It's often not remembered that New Zealand did leave its division at the request of the British government in North Africa after the Battle of El Alamein, but it did raise another one. The 3rd New Zealand Division was raised in New Zealand for Pacific service, and the RNZN and the RNZAF were committed, of course, in support of it. And there were New Zealand troops and commandos who made opposed amphibious landings in the Solomons with losses, killed in action and wounded. It was a very worrying time for New Zealand with so few of its men at home. And of course, New Zealand looked from the point of view of the New Zealand government like an easy prize which might turn Australia's flank. My father-in-law was sent to Norfolk Island as a New Zealand older soldier, and they were all told to sharpen their bayonets. So it got quite serious. Nobody was sure what the Japanese were going to do next. They certainly were coming at speed across the Pacific. Fiji was thought of as a likely target for the next landings. In 1942, Churchill asked Roosevelt to send US troops to New Zealand so that the New Zealand division could remain in North Africa and not return to the Pacific. And that's how it worked. There was a very large USN mobile hospital set up in Auckland. There were training facilities made available to the United States Army throughout New Zealand, and a very large number of Americans who'd never set foot out of their home state found themselves in New Zealand, a country that they found very compatible and very welcoming. Leander was a ship that was known for her capabilities, but she had them added to when she was given a new version of radar. If you look at the lattice tower in front of the funnel on the photograph there, this was a result of the Radio Development Laboratory, which was set up in New Zealand, developing radars with the UK. And these first sets of ship warning radars were an improvement on the very first radars fitted, and they were aboard both Achilles and Leander. And of course, by this stage, aircraft are becoming less and less necessary because radars working both day and night and doing what the aircraft were intended to do, which was provide over-the-horizon warning and a local picture to the captains of these cruisers as to what to expect as they steamed. Leander ceased to be a lucky ship in July 1943 at the Battle of Kolombangara, having taken part in several bombardments. She was very badly hit by a torpedo, a long-lance torpedo. 28 sailors were killed in the explosion, most of them down in the boiler room where the torpedo had struck. There were 7 men manning one of the anti-aircraft guns, and they were blown over the side by a plume of water forced up through a vent. All power was lost on the ship, and the commander, Stephen Roskill, Royal Navy, was the executive officer. He was known to be obsessed with damage control. He was wounded himself quite seriously, and he just kept on bravely directing the teams working through the ship, shoring up bulkheads and making sure that something in the way of power remained. And he saved the ship from sinking. There's no question about that. He goes on, of course, to be the famous Captain Stephen Roskill, Royal Navy, who wrote The War at Sea, which is still a major source for naval historians. He spent the rest of his life doing that. And he himself had been heavily involved in this dramatic and disastrous action where the Battle of Kolombangara claimed a number of ships, very nearly claimed Leander. The problem was that the ship had an enormous gaping hole in her, and it was impossible to get down into the boiler room to get the men out who had been killed on board. So Leander entered Tulagi with the chaplain reading prayers for the 26 dead and the missing men who were still on board but couldn't yet be accessed. And for a week in Tulagi, officers and men worked without ceasing, making the basic repairs to the ship, which allowed it to somehow make its way back to Devonport to Calliope Dock. And the dockyard staff there quickly saw that full repairs were way beyond their capability, and the ship had to be patched up and sail to Boston in order to be brought back into the war. Many of the bodies that they discovered down in the boiler room and the engine spaces were unrecognizable, and they were taken for burial from where they died when the torpedo hit. If you look at the size of that hole, it is an absolute miracle that Leander was saved. It was one of the finest feats of damage control done by anyone during the Second World War, certainly by the RNZN. In January of 43, two minesweepers, Kiwi and Moa, which had been built in Greenock in Scotland and brought out, found themselves together repeatedly attacking an I-class Japanese submarine, which they came across surfaced off Guadalcanal. It was an extraordinary affair. The I-class submarine didn't submerge, stayed there, and just fired a deck gun and machine guns at the ships, but seemed to be incapable of diving, which was the obvious thing that an I-class submarine should have done, and then picked them both off with torpedoes later. Instead of which, they repeatedly both got the chance to ram her. No one quite knew what the correct order was for ramming a submarine, but they got on with it anyway. It was a major source of Allied intelligence, rather like Bulldog getting hold of the Enigma machine in the North Atlantic. This was a chance to get hold of the code books on board the submarine. And the Americans the next morning went over and got the code books, took them back to Hawaii, where they were made very good use of. There was an RNZN leading signalman, Campbell Buchanan. He was age 22. He was on the bridge of Moa, on the bridge of Kiwi. He was shining his searchlight on the submarine in order to illuminate her for the gunners. And of course, his light became an obvious point of aim for everybody on board this submarine. He was mortally wounded. He stayed at his light. He was posthumously mentioned in dispatches. He was awarded the US Naval Cross for his bravery. In those days, if you were talking about posthumous decorations, there was only mention in dispatches or a VC. I can think of no reason why he wasn't given a VC for what he did. But there you go. That's the way the world was in those days, not as it is today. Achilles ran out of luck on the 5th of January, 1943. She was helping Task Force 67 bombard Munda Island, and suddenly 4 Japanese aircraft appeared, and they bombed, and without result. And that was thought to be all that was going to happen. Then 4 more appeared. An X turret was badly hit with a bomb. It blew the lid off. It killed 13 Royal Marines and injured 8 more. Fortunately for the ship, if one can say that, it was a turret that was hit and took the brunt of the damage. Otherwise, it might have been considerably more dangerous for the ship's capacity to steam. But it did mean that she had to go for a refit all the way around to Britain, and Achilles was out of the war for the next 18 months. And her ship's company were transferred to the next cruiser to become an RNZN ship, Gambia. Monowai was an armed merchant cruiser taken up from trade, and she was attacked by a Japanese submarine, I-20, off Suva with a deck gun, and then she had 4 torpedoes fired at her, but she was driven away by Monowai's 6-inch gunfire, so she was a lucky ship to survive. In 1944, the Admiralty said, we want her for D-Day. She was refitted with capacity for 1,800 troops. All her lifeboats were replaced with a landing craft, as you can see there, and she was used in Normandy, and Canadians and British troops went ashore from her. She kept going back and forth across the Channel, and in 44-45, she moved 75,000 soldiers to France from UK and was finally returned to New Zealand and continued her career as a merchant ship in New Zealand waters. Flower-class corvettes came to New Zealand, Arbutus and Erebus. Erebus had a very short career. Arbutus was heavily involved in mine sweeping and was present all the way through to the surrender in Tokyo Bay as one of the ships that was represented the RNZN. By 1945, the RNZN had 60 ships, albeit many of them were small and taken up from trade, but that, of course, was true of everyone's Navy. The number of purpose-built warships was much smaller than the number of ships that had been pressed into service. But it was a considerable force. And though, of course, tiny by comparison with the British Pacific Fleet, it made its contribution from a country whose population was still less than 2 million at that time. HMNZS Gambia, the Fiji-class cruiser, was made available, and the ship's companies of Leander and Achilles joined her, some of Leander's, some of Achilles, and of course, RN officers, senior sailors remained on board to provide her with the experience that she was needed to bring her all the way out to join the Eastern Fleet, first of all, and then later to go on and join the British Pacific Fleet when it assembled in the Pacific. And Sydney, of course, was her base, as was the British Pacific Fleet. We tend to forget the scale of the Royal Navy's involvement in the Pacific War. Obviously, nothing like the size of the American one, but nevertheless, the British Pacific Fleet was the largest fleet the Royal Navy put to sea in wartime in its entire history. And we tend to forget just how much of that was supported not only from Manus, Admiralty Island as it was then, but also directly from Sydney. It was a major effort for a country that had been at war since 1939 to do so much in such a distant part of the world. And this was despite the wishes of Admiral Ernest King, USN, who wanted the Royal Navy kept out of the Pacific altogether. Just as well he didn't succeed, because the British Pacific Fleet made a very great contribution to the overall success of the island hopping campaign going north to Japan. There's HMNZS Gambia firing a broadside of 4-inch close-range guns, bombarding Okinawa. You can tell how close in she was if she was firing 4-inch guns. That was the last great naval battle of World War II, and it was a huge affair, and it took an enormous amount of time and men's lives to secure Okinawa so that it could be used as the last jumping off point for the proposed and intended invasion of Japan. HMNZS Gambia is credited with firing the last shots of the Second World War. On the 15th of August, the ceasefire was announced, and later that day, or simultaneously, depending on whose book you read, a Japanese aircraft appeared to be attacking the force. Gambia took no chances, engaged that aircraft, and so claimed the distinction of firing the last shots of the war. And then a platoon of Royal Marines and Gambia's officers landed on the 20th of August and took the surrender of Yokosuka Naval Base without incident. Gambia stayed on and was involved in going to Hong Kong and to other places to represent the return to Britain of the colonies that had been taken off it by the Japanese at the beginning of the war. And so that was a major warship, 12 6-inch guns, and the RNZN made up a very large part of the ship's complement. Achilles had been refitted and came back into the battle in September 1944. She rejoined the British Pacific Fleet, and she bombarded the Japanese stronghold of Truk Lagoon. And she was in Tokyo Bay with Arbutus on the 6th of October for the Japanese surrender ceremony, which you can see being signed there by MacArthur. Achilles had the unique distinction of being at the very first naval battle, the River Plate, and at the last, Okinawa. And then, of course, she comes back to the UK. She's refitted and sold to the Indian Navy and becomes INS Delhi, and plays the part of herself in the film of the Battle of the River Plate, made in the 1950s. New Zealand naval prisoners of war. There's an ensign made by the New Zealand sailors who had it in readiness for flying when they were liberated from a camp in Indonesia. There were 80 New Zealand officers and ratings made naval POWs, 16 captured by the Germans. They all survived and came home, but those held in Japanese camps were typically treated with brutality, and 14 of the 64 New Zealand sailors died while in captivity. Now, all of those people I selected from the website that the Royal New Zealand Navy Museum keeps. There were many more I could have selected. The top row are sailors, the bottom row is officers. All of them were decorated for their service in World War II. Many more than that, of course, were decorated. I just decided to give you a representative 6. And you can see there that one of those young men, the one in the top left-hand corner, was in RN submarines. Not a common trade for the RNZN VR, but there were submariners. There were a lot, as I said, of Fleet Air Arm pilots, many of whom made a very great contribution to the fighting strength of the British Pacific Fleet. That memorial, which you can't miss because it's immediately inside the gate as you go on board Philomel, records the names of 352 officers and sailors of the RNZN who died in all parts of the world during World War II and who have no known grave. And 150 of those died with Rory O'Connor in 1941 in Neptune, a terrible and tragic loss. So the RNZN post-war, what was it going to do? What was it going to be? Well, it was still culturally very much part of the RN, but it was still paid for by New Zealand, the New Zealand government. It simply couldn't recruit and man the ships it wanted to have. And Jack Welch, who's an ex-Royal New Zealand Navy CN, wrote, "The officer corps and senior specialist ratings were dependent on loan and exchange RN personnel. Our RNZN officers and senior ratings were trained in the UK. We borrowed the RN's administrative regulations, amended them to local conditions. The Empire was alive and well. Operationally, the RNZN was still very strongly tied to the UK." I think it's fair to say that so was the RAN at that time. The decision was made to have cruisers, and they were to be part of the complementary force of battleships, aircraft carriers, destroyers, and cruisers that the RN, the RAN, and the RNZN would be able to operate in the Southeast Asian sphere and what was still known in those days as the Far East. There was a mutiny or a strike, depending on which way you like to look at it. In April 1947, the New Zealand government failed to implement the plan to put in new pay rates retrospectively. There were disgruntled ratings, many of them hostilities-only men who really had no wish to continue serving. They held a meeting. They decided to go on a strike in protest of the government's failure to do what they said they were going to do. Some of the RNZN crew, but not the RNers, from the newly arrived HMNZS Bellona, joined them. They all marched out the front gate and went down to the park in Devonport and had a chinwag about that. The New Zealand government issued an ultimatum. Only 23 of them returned to duty. The remaining mutineers, if that's what you're going to call them, were discharged from the RNZN. Subsequently, the pay was made retrospective, an example of the Navy being messed about with by a government that didn't understand its own business. One of the immediate results of this was that with 187 men missing from a very small Navy, Peter Phipps immediately phoned up an ex-Wrens officer and said, "How would you feel about coming back and reforming the Wrens?" So they were only actually not serving as Wrens for about a year and a half, 2 years, when it was quickly realized that no Navy in its right mind wants to try to operate without Wrens in those days, and of course, without both genders today. 6 ex-Lock class frigates were acquired. All of them had been on anti-submarine duties in the North Atlantic and the Arctic. Loch Shin, Loch Fyne, Loch Achray, Loch Lomond. They all got turned into Lake class, still called Lock class frigates in New Zealand, named after New Zealand locks. And New Zealand committed all 6 of those Lock class frigates to the Korean War between 1950 and 53 in support of the British Commonwealth contribution at sea to the United Nations, led by the carrier HMS Glory. It was a tough life up there, particularly in the wintertime, as anyone who's seen pictures of what happened when HMAS Sydney was trying to launch aircraft off its flight decks in heaving seas and ice. Watch keeping on open bridges, tough life. They had some significant moments. They put men ashore who actually captured North Korean prisoners and handed them over to the Brits. It wasn't all steaming around in ever-diminishing circles at sea. They played their part in shore bombardments. Tarpo moved to attack North Korean sampans, which were carrying a small invasion force, and it sank 10. That almost proved her undoing, as the North Korean shore batteries had the range and began to straddle the ship with salvos. And she hastily withdrew, having done what she was asked to do. There's HMNZS Tarpo's 4-inch gun bombardment going on off Korea, and you can see Tarpo's Piper standing up on the 4-inch gun coming back alongside at the end of the deployment. It was rough and ready stuff, but there were small ships with one 4-inch gun. They did what they were asked to do. They did it well. The Spithead Review. We have a new queen. She's got a Spithead Review. There's a coronation to attend, and the ship chosen was HMNZS Black Prince, taken out of mothballs and reanimated to go over there, and was welcomed, of course. Look at the size of the Royal Navy off Spithead in 1953. We can only wonder. There's the Tri-Service Coronation Contingent in 53. You can see the matron, whose picture you saw earlier on there, with her distinctive hat in the middle there. And you can see the RNZN, the RNZAF, and the New Zealand Army all out at Henley having a good time. The Queen, God bless her, she came back to see us in 1953-54. She was here over Christmas during the terrible Tangiwai disaster, which occurred when a New Zealand train didn't know that a bridge had been swept away by a lahar that had come down as a result of a volcanic eruption in the middle of the North Island. There she is there, inspecting front and rear rank inspection of the RNZN. At this time, there were many decorated wartime RNVR officers who were not going to get a career in the RN, and they came to New Zealand, some of them on loan service and then stayed. Others were recruited directly. They were known to those who were serving as the Hungry 100, and the thought was that it would be unfair if they were promoted repeatedly, excluding from such opportunities those who were New Zealand born. Well, that didn't last very long. They became New Zealanders in every sense of the word. They made a huge contribution, first of all, in the Loch-class frigates, which they were so familiar with from the war, and then later, of course, they went on to be senior officers. And when I joined the RNZN in 1974, some of the Hungry 100 were still with us as very senior officers, and wonderful people they were, with a great war record, and brought with them experience and naval capabilities and love of the Navy that we couldn't have replicated easily in those early years in the 1950s. I take my hat off to the Hungry 100. They did a great job. There were also 300 sailors recruited, some of them on loan service, who stayed on, having liked what they saw in New Zealand, others of them on 3- and 6-year rotations. Australia was also helpful in making a gift. 4 Australian-built Bathurst-class minesweepers, Inverell, Kiama, Echuca, and Stowell. They all kept their Australian town names because it was thought that they were on loan. In fact, of course, they never came home. They stayed with the RNZN, and the last one paid off in 1976. My training ship was Inverell, whom you see there leaping out of the water in enthusiasm. They were known as ships that could roll on wet grass. People in hammocks were far more comfortable than people in bunks, in my experience. They were a great way of getting your sea legs. There was an occasion during the war when a battleship steamed past a Bathurst-class minesweeper. It was rolling so violently that the battleship signaled, "I can see down your funnel, your fire is burning brightly." They were maids of all work who did an enormous amount of good in the Second World War in this part of the world and in with the Indians of Burma. And they went on being seaworthy and useful right through into the 1970s. Thank you, Australia. HMNZS Lachlan was built as a hydrographic survey ship for the RAN. She went to war off Borneo's beaches, charting where the landings were going to be. And she was then loaned to the RNZN to chart New Zealand and the Pacific Islands. Some of the charts that she replaced were those that Cook had done down in Fiordland. And of course, being the man he was, Lachlan was able to confirm the complete accuracy of what he had found all that time before. In due course, Lachlan was clearly not going home either, and the New Zealand government paid the Australian government £16,000 for her, which I think was a bargain, because she went on to do great work, particularly in the Pacific, where there was a need to chart accurately long before the days of satellite hydrography. The RNZN got involved in the Antarctic. Huge areas of the Antarctic were unknown and uncharted because wars had intervened, and the great age of death and glory on the big ice was long in the past. HMNZS Endeavour was bought and strengthened insofar as it's possible to strengthen a wooden ship for the Antarctic, but she went down there and she provided the Trans-Antarctic Expedition and the Antarctic Geophysical Year of 57, 58 with transport for the tractors that Ed Hillary and Vivian Fuchs took with them, communications, stores, fuel, medical cover, and of course, personnel. The crossing party, this was to be the expedition that finally did what Shackleton had hoped to do, was led by the British explorer, Dr. Vivian Fuchs, who was knighted while he was still down there by the Queen. The Ross Sea party was led by New Zealand climber Sir Edmund Hillary, who with Tenzing Norgay had just shinned up Everest. One of the young communication sailors on board that went with Hillary was young Peter Mulgrew. My father, as the RNZN's doctor at Philomel, examined Peter Mulgrew and pronounced him fit to go on the trip. Peter Mulgrew has a separate career later in which he becomes a very significant mountaineer in the Himalayas. He loses both feet to frostbite and can climb no more, which is why it's he that is the guide in the cabin of the Air New Zealand jet which slammed into Mount Erebus, killing everybody on board. So June Mulgrew, his widow, was of course comforted in her loss by Ed Hillary. A little time later, Ed Hillary's wife and daughter were lost in a tragic flying accident in the Himalayas, and Ed Hillary and June Mulgrew get together, make a second very successful marriage, having married each other's partners. So Peter Mulgrew is one of those New Zealanders that we remember with fondness for his wonderful character and his preparedness to be available, but he, of course, died very tragically. Operation Grapple, 1956 to 1957, UK thermonuclear test. This is the hydrogen bomb being tested far away from Britain. Operation Grapple was at Christmas Island, and there were an awful lot of sailors who were far too close to the hydrogen bomb test when they went off. 500 New Zealand sailors from the frigates Rotoiti and Pukaki were exposed to what was believed to be safe levels of radiation, but which turned out, in fact, to be life-shortening. There was a lot of legal cases run about this in the 1970s while these men were still alive. And of course, as we now know, there are intergenerational effects of exposure to radiation. Pukaki got to within 6 nautical miles of this explosion, far too close. A tragic event, really, should not have happened. Royalist was the third of the improved didos brought out of storage for the RNZN. She sailed out through the Mediterranean, exercising at Malta in 1956, at the very time that Gamal Nasser seized the Suez Canal. Of course, Royalists hoped to be involved, but the New Zealand government said, nope, that's not our fight. You just come straight on to us. And I think, in fact, she had to sail all the way around South Africa in order to get to New Zealand. She undertook some operations against Malayan terrorists during the Malayan emergency, shore bombardments. She exercised constantly with the RN and RAN ships. She visited Japan, Vietnam, and the Philippines. On one notable occasion, Captain Thorne brought her home from Sydney across the Tasman at high speed because he wanted to see an All Black match at Eden Park, and he didn't do her any good at all by driving her quite so hard. He was known thereafter as Storm Thorne. The ship was not really very suitable for the role in which she was employed, having been designed for the Arctic and for the North Atlantic. She lacked air conditioning. She was a very hot ship to live in. I don't think anyone could deny the beauty of the design. Magnificent looking ships, but really probably almost obsolete by the time she arrived in 56. And certainly what became obvious is that her machinery, particularly her boilers and condensers, were obsolete. In 65, Royalist received an excellent pass at Pearl Harbor when she was working up there, but later in that year off the Solomon, she broke down. She was in the Coral Sea. There was a real risk of her drifting onto coral reefs. A tug came up from Brisbane and made sure that didn't happen. And then Lachlan arrived to tow her back towards New Zealand. With incredible stamina and fortitude, the engineering team on board worked day and night and managed to get enough power back so that the last cruiser in the RNZN steamed back into Auckland under her own power, but she never moved again. it was not worthwhile trying to replace those antique boilers and condensers and get her to a state where she could serve on. Her day was done, and with it, the era of the RNZN cruisers, which had started with Chatham way back in 1921. In 1968, the New Zealand White Ensign was replaced by the Royal Navy St. George, replaced the Royal Navy St. George's Cross White Ensign that had previously been worn by ships of the RNZN. An effort had been made right in the early days by the Royal Australian Navy and the Australian government to get a separate ensign for the RAN way back before the First World War, but that had been quickly quashed by the Admiralty. So we all served, or the RAN and the RNZN served under the St. George's Cross White Ensign right through into the 1960s. But there you are, you can see it being paraded there, and there's the RNZN Queen's colour. It became a frigate navy. We had Taranaki, Otago, Blackpool, Waikato, Wellington, Southland, and Canterbury. And so it's a long period of time between Taranaki in 1960 and 2005, the last of them, Canterbury. They all played a part in showing the flag, doing what was required of them. We can't go through all their missions, of course, but suffice to say that they were the right ships at the right time. And in an age where we're constantly debating the importance of continuous shipbuilding, it should be pointed out that the original Rothesay Whitby class that started off being built in Britain evolved over time into the Broadbeam Leanders. The ships at the end of their period of building, continuous shipbuilding, were very much improved and much more capable ships than the earliest ships, which reminds one that just because you've laid down a ship doesn't mean that you're wedded to that design forevermore. You can be bright and do interesting things as the class of ships develop. I believe we will do that with our Hunter class. There's Taranaki on a SEATO exercise in May '64. We tend to forget about SEATO now, but it was intended to be the anti-Soviet, anti-communist alliance, which was going to keep the United States and the Commonwealth countries joined together in opposition to the expansion of the Russian or the Soviet Navy in our part of the world. It was intended to contain insurgency ashore and to promote Western interests. And of course, it gets tied up with the fact that the Vietnam War fails and it's abolished at the same time as the end of the American presence ashore in Southeast Asia. But it was a useful alliance, and you can see there Taranaki exercising with a British carrier. The RNZ became the guardian of New Zealand's offshore estate. For 4 decades, it was the RNZN which provided the most regular logistical sea link and resupply to the islands around New Zealand. And it was also New Zealand frigates that provided the weather ships for those going south to the Antarctic. And a more unpleasant and difficult task, it's hard to imagine, than bobbing around in very great seas down there in below the roaring 40s and the screaming 60s at times, making sure that the ships approaching and the aircraft flying overhead knew what weather to expect. In 1974, I was the youngest and therefore the most logical officer to make the ship's divisional officer. Said that very carefully. On board Taranaki. We went to Campbell Island to bring back to New Zealand the sheep that had bred there without interruption since the sheep station had been abandoned in the 1930s. We slung a sheep pen athwart the mortar well, and it had stenciled on the side, "Sheep shippers to the nation, a subdivision of Muldoon Enterprises," Muldoon being the Prime Minister of the day. And we came back into Wellington with the sheep bleating aft in their pen and a piper piping forward on the 4-5 turret. And so that was my brief stint as a ship's divisional officer. Canterbury was the last of the ships ordered, and she arrived in 1971, the last steam-driven RNZN ship built in Scotland, launched in '70, and went on to be a very great asset to the fleet. And of course, as you can see, there's her Westland her Westland Wasp sitting there aft on her flight deck. These are the Waikato and Canterbury are the first ships to fly aircraft again. It's been a long time since the days of the Pusser's Ducks on Achilles and Leander, and we needed to get some pilots and to get back in the air. The Westland Wasp was known to generations of pilots and aircrew as the Flying Bedstead. Of course, one of them successfully put a missile through the fin of the Santa Fe while alongside at Grytviken, when RN1. So they were not without the capacity to sting these Wasps. They had 2 homing torpedoes to deal with hostile submarines. Speed of 90 knots. They greatly extended the ASW engagement ranges from hundreds of yards to miles. Mortars were no longer relevant to any ASW battle, if indeed they had been. The French nuclear tests at the Mururoa Atoll came immediately after a new Labour government came into power in New Zealand, and the New Zealand Labour government decided that it wasn't going to put up with French letting off their dirty bombs in the atmosphere. Most of the countries of the South Pacific, including New Zealand, had signed up to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the RNZN was asked to go and enforce, well, not enforce, but at least to witness what was going on there, and to draw the world's attention to the fact that these hugely damaging radioactive bombs were being let off by the French over French Pacific territory. Otago went there with the cabinet minister on board, and she was relieved by HMNZS Canterbury, and HMAS Supply came across and provided fuel and food. It didn't work immediately, but it did work. French atmospheric testing, nuclear testing did stop. They then went underground, and another 150 nuclear tests were conducted inside the atoll, and there is reason to believe that the atolls were cracked by these atomic bombs or these nuclear bombs, and that much of the pollution that has affected the lives of people living in that area was the result of that contamination of the sea in the area where they still live. In 1982, Britain went to war over the Falkland Islands. I'm not sure if Jeremy Larkin is online or not. I hope he is. But of course, he was intimately involved as the commanding officer of HMS Fearless down in San Carlos Water, fending off the Argentine Air Force. When the Falkland Islanders had been effectively taken prisoner, some would say hostage, the New Zealand government made the offer to take the entire population of the Falkland Islands and relocate them in the South Island of New Zealand and provide them with a living there. It was suggested that they would hardly notice the difference between the Falklands and the South Island in winter, as they're both pretty bleak and miserable places at that time of the year. The British government, Mrs. Thatcher in particular, rejected that kind offer and pressed ahead with the liberation of the islanders from their captors. But Britain went when the New Zealand government did do more. It made available Canterbury and Waikato that took over the RN's role in the Persian Gulf, releasing 2 RN frigates for service in the South Atlantic. So no New Zealanders and no New Zealand ships went to the Falklands, but effectively they made available 2 frigates that could. The other thing that happened is HMNZS Irirangi, which was and is the New Zealand signal traffic station in the middle of the North Island, co-located with Waihuru Army Camp, became an absolutely indispensable part of the communications chain by which the task force was communicating with the MOD in the UK. So that was another signal effort, shall we say. It's 2,600 feet above sea level, and it has an uninterrupted capability for taking and receiving signal traffic around the Southern Hemisphere and into the north. New Zealand nuclear-powered cruiser USS Truxtun entered Auckland Harbour in 1976 and Wellington in 1982, despite the protest fleets that were arrayed against it on each occasion. I was present with the Commodore Auckland on North Head as Truxtun came in 76, surrounded by most of the RNZN, bringing her in at a very low speed, trying very hard to ensure the ships didn't go over any of the protest fleet, people in yachts, as you can see there below. There was a very strong anti-nuclear feeling then, and it has remained. The 1984 elected New Zealand government implemented a nuclear-free zone around New Zealand in 1987, and that incensed the US government. Caspar Weinberger, the then Secretary of State, made the remark that as far as New Zealand was concerned, they'd lost their address, which was a pretty unfortunate thing to say about a country that had done so much to support the US during the Second World War. However, it led to a deterioration of relations, an American withdrawal of support for New Zealand under the ANZUS Security Treaty, and of course, no USN ships came for 33 years. There's the New Zealand Prime Minister of the day, David Lange, in the USA in 1984, letting the Americans know that this will be the plan, that nothing nuclear will enter New Zealand waters now or ever. The Rainbow Warrior was an extension of this business of non-nuclear, because the Rainbow Warrior was a regular visitor to Mururoa Atoll. The French took the view that if they could just quietly get rid of it, it had ceased to be an embarrassment. They designed something called Opération Satanique, which of course is a pretty good name for what they were doing, because they decided to bomb Rainbow Warrior where she was alongside at Marsden Wharf. She was sunk by a group of French saboteurs of the DGSE. They were Navy divers. They put limpet mines on her. When she blew up, a Greenpeace photographer went back in to collect his camera equipment and lost his life as the ship sank. 2 hours after the explosion, Navy's operational diving team entered the wreck and discovered his body. And the dive team also did a search of the hull to make sure there were no unexploded ordnance. And then eventually the ship was raised, taken over to Calliope Dock, and later taken out to sea and sunk. The principal two members of the DGSE team, Alain Marfat and Dominique Prieur, were taken. They were tried in a New Zealand court, originally sentenced to long sentences in a New Zealand prison, and later under a deal, they were released to Howe Atoll, where one made the other pregnant, and then they both went home. But it's a disgraceful episode in the history of our relationship with the French, but one that I think probably by now we've just about recovered from. 4 RNZN frigates in Wellington Harbour in 1990. Bacante was to become Wellington. She was delayed in arriving because of the Falklands War when she was needed. Dido became Southland. They both needed extraordinarily expensive refits before they could become operational in Portsmouth. And eventually they came out and they gave good service, but not because of the state they were in when they were handed over, but the state they were in after the refits, which the New Zealand government paid very heavily for. So they weren't cheap ships. And they were stopgaps to keep the Navy's Leander-class frigate fleet operational after Taranaki and Otago had both got to be decommissioned due to age in '83. They had regular refits in Calliope Dock, and then they returned to sea to continue their tasks. And they remained operational in the RNZN well past the expected service date they would have had for ships of that age in the RN. New Zealand is particularly good at keeping old ships running long past their use-by date, and it has to be. Here's HMNZS Endeavour, a new Endeavour. We keep calling ships Endeavour. There she is with Southland, former Dido, as you see there, carrying, you see, the Australian Ikara on her bow rather than a 4.5-inch gun. 4 Lake-class patrol vessels were bought, and they operated on anti-fishery protection patrols for 10 years between 1980 and 1990. Unfortunately, they were just too short. And in the long Pacific rollers, which are much greater wave intervals between them than those in the Mediterranean or even the Atlantic, they used to fall off one wave and before they were properly on the next, which left their screws exposed, and they got screaming screw syndrome. Far too many gearboxes were destroyed by the speed at which the shafts were turning out while the propellers were out of the water. And so they didn't last terribly long. But the requirement to do fishery protection became even more important when New Zealand's economic exclusion zone went out to 200 Ks. And there's how we are there patrolling off the south of Stewart Island, which is the most southerly of the New Zealand island chain. The RNZN got involved in peace talks between the Papua New Guinea government and the Bougainville attempted government. Bougainville would very much like to be independent of PNG and has made several efforts to do it. Warfare broke out in the 1980s, and in 1990, RNZN ships facilitated peace talks between the dissidents if that's what you call them, and the Papua New Guinean government. There was a state of war between them. Frigates Wellington and Waikato provide accommodation for the two rival negotiating teams, and Endeavour became the place where the negotiations were signed and the Endeavour Treaty was signed. It was a neutral venue. Unfortunately, that wasn't the end of the matter, and New Zealand had to be regularly involved in trying to bring peace to these warring participants over the next 10 years, and has largely succeeded. There was a peacekeeping force went ashore to enforce it at one stage. But there you are. That's an unusual use for a tanker, a peace negotiation venue. I was talking to you about anti-fishery patrols. The Southern Ocean, of course, is a rich fishing ground for Patagonian toothfish poachers. There you can see the offshore patrol vessel Wellington with the Ross Ice Shelf behind her. It wasn't her, but during the 1999, there were toothfish poachers caught and deterred from continuing with their fishing, illegal fishing. Of course, New Zealand, as you can see from the little map there, has responsibility for the New Zealand Ross dependency in the same way that Australia has responsibility for its Antarctic waters and enforces fishery protection down there. There was an incident in 1994 where HMNZS Monowai found itself as the nearest vessel rescuing 8 yachtsmen during the Auckland to Tonga regatta. This was a life-saving mission, not dissimilar to the sorts of things that the RAN has done on a number of occasions. It was very difficult because there was no helicopter on board Monowai, and a RIB had to go in the water to rescue 8 sailors to bring them back and to get them, save them from certain drowning. Then, of course, the question came up, well, we're going to go on being a frigate navy, but what frigates are we going to have? The New Zealand public had come to the end of its enthusiasm for ships that were war fighting as opposed to fishery protection and civil emergency ships. And these two ships, Tamana and Te Kaha, had been ordered before the incoming Labour government could stop them from being built by Tenex in Australia. But certainly they stopped the idea of 2 more being built. So the RNZN became a 2-ship navy only, a 2-frigate navy only, I should say. And of course, it made absolute sense that they should be Anzac-class, Meko-class frigates designed by the Germans, but built by the Australians. They're very combat-capable ships. They work with allies. They patrol the Southern Ocean. They participate in UN peacekeeping missions. They do all the things that you'd expect surface combatants to do. And of course, the dear old Seacat missile of the Leanders had been well and truly replaced by much more capable missiles. And of course, by the Cayman Super Sea Sprite helicopter, which was bought from Cayman, not adapted, just kept as it was, no attempts at a major digital upgrade, which the Fleet Air, the RAN Fleet Air Arm was told to do. And the consequence is that these aircraft have given very good service over a very long period of time. You note that they're both named after, with Maori names, Te Mana and Te Kaha, and attractive names. And it was appropriate that the Maori Queen commissioned Te Mana, which means honor, into the RNZN in 1999. There's the Cayman Super Sea Sprite. They've gone through a number of iterations of it. The most recent updated ones were delivered in 2015. They're equipped with Penguin anti-ship missiles, and Mark 46 torpedoes can be fitted. And of course, there's a general purpose machine gun. And it does a perfectly satisfactory job of providing Te Mana and Te Kaha with some serious strike power and ASW capability. There they are in the Persian Gulf, 1990 to as far as 2003. They repeatedly went up there right through the 1990s in support of UN sanctions after Gulf War I, and then in Operation Enduring Freedom in 2003. Te Mana and Te Kaha were part of the task force ensuring that Taliban and Al-Qaeda smuggling of people and weapons was stopped. They didn't fire their main armament in anger, as HMAS Anzac did on 5-inch Friday, but they certainly played their part in carrying out multiple boardings and escorted merchant ships through contested sea lanes. Very highly praised and thanks by the USN commanders of the task force. In 1999, New Zealand was asked to make its contribution to the International Force East Timor and did so. A very large proportion of the New Zealand Army went ashore in East Timor, and it was appropriate that both Te Kaha and Canterbury were on station offshore to not only support them, but also to support the medical teams that went ashore from the ships to do what they could to assist with the dreadful level of wounding and depredation that had been visited on the simple people of Dili, who were abused and murdered by the Indonesian army as it left. And you can see there an East Timorese girl sitting in the arms of a New Zealand soldier, a female soldier, and scrawled on the wall behind is "I love military New Zealand." So clearly it was a very major contribution for a very small New Zealand Defence Force, and the Navy were a part of that, and honourably so, and indeed took casualties. In 2002, HMS Nottingham took on Wolf Rock off Lord Howe Island, and Wolf Rock won, not surprisingly. The ship ended up with a 30-foot gash in her hull and was in imminent danger of sinking. The commanding officer, Commander Richard Farrington, was ashore looking after a sailor who had to be evacuated. He was in the air at the moment that his ship struck Wolf Rock. It turned out that a junior officer of the watch had left a rolling rule over the chart, which showed where exactly on the chart Wolf Rock was. And the navigator wasn't aware of it. And the first anyone knew about it was when the ship struck the rock. It was a dreadfully dangerous moment for the whole ship's company. Tamana and Endeavour has arrived at the nick of time. They provided timely assistance. They got all the non-essential ship's company off. They helped get steel that was brought from Australia by the RNZAF, and that was welded into the gash to keep Nottingham afloat. There was an elderly chief shipwright Royal Navy on board who did a magnificent job. He carried far more shoring beams than anybody thought any ship could possibly need, and he used every one of them to shore up bulkheads and make sure that the ship stayed on an even keel. Farrington's problem was that he had to counter flood in order to keep the ship from keeling over. Fuel from Endeavour kept Nottingham's generators working, and damage control was undertaken. It was a very great example of the RN and the RNZN working together, greatly to the benefit of the Royal Navy, which was mightily impressed by the speed and efficiency of the RNZN's response to this unusual event. Fortunately, it was a calm sea state throughout. Otherwise, it's hard to say whether Nottingham could have survived. The most important thing is that in this whole episode, no lives were lost, only reputations and seniority, including that, of course, of the commanding officer, as you would expect. He, I think, was a man who'd done a very fine job of commanding his ship, but he happened to be away at the time of the incident, and he was court-martialed for not having left sufficiently detailed orders for his bridge watchkeeping team. It's hard to know what else he could have done. Nottingham, as you can see from the bottom photograph, was shipped back to the UK for major repairs. She was repaired and continued to serve for a few more years. There's Endeavour and Tamana after the rescue, returning to Auckland. Endeavour was by then quite an old ship, but she was still very capable. She made the rescue possible. So another example of a ship that didn't anticipate being involved in something as major as that, but certainly played her role with great accomplishment. There's an offshore patrol vessel, Wellington and Otago, with other patrol vessels around her. This is part of the Project Protector, which was designed to give New Zealand the offshore fishery protection and EEZ enforcement capability, which a small country a long way away from the rest of the world most certainly needs. HMS Canterbury, the new one, arrived in 2009, the old one having been paid off with much sadness in 2005. And you can see there that this is a ship designed for a very specific role of logistical support. That's her job. And there she is there in 2016, the anniversary of the RNZN 75th anniversary come into existence. There she is at Waitangi with the Maori canoe that's kept at Waitangi for these events in the foreground. In 2016, Canterbury's role as a lift and shift ship came into its own. The 75th anniversary was about to occur. There were ships from all over the world coming, including HMAS Darwin, to Auckland to celebrate. And suddenly they found themselves all diverted to Kaikoura in the northern part of the South Island, where a magnitude 7.6 earthquake had struck. The town was completely cut off. Roads had slipped away, and a lot of people have been injured. And it was necessary to get in there by sea. There was no other way of doing it. And a number of ships did. An American ship, first for 33 years, USS Sampson, flew her helicopters in, her sea lift helicopters, and that made a very good impression on everybody. At Canterbury did the major lift, which was a 6-hour journey from Kaikoura down to Lyttelton, Christchurch's port, with 450 evacuees and 4 dogs, and returned with equipment, generators, and supplies for the town. So very much a recreation of what Veronica did all those years ago in Napier in 1931. Fortunately, on this occasion, there was no loss of life, but there certainly was an urgent need to restore services and to get people who didn't need to be there out. And most of those 450 evacuees were, in fact, backpackers who were enjoying Kaikoura and its tremendous holiday facilities. The Anzacs, like our RAN Anzacs, were getting old, and if they were to be continued in service, they needed major upgrades to make them fit for purpose. And the decision was made not to refit them in Australia, but in Canada, which had the capability to do it. Lockheed Martin took over. They were both sailed to Canada, one after the other. And with COVID interrupting and making it all much harder and longer than was anticipated, both ships have now been brought up to a much more effective state than they were in prior to the refit. They've got new combat management systems. They've got new sensors, including sonar and radar. They've got the new Sea Scepter missile system, which you see there. They've got self-defense missile decoys and a torpedo defense system. And there's a combat trainer in Devonport to help people to learn how to use all that new kit. But of course, the time will come when even refitted Anzacs need to be replaced. And there are some decisions being made by people who are online at the moment about where exactly in the world those ships are going to be sourced from. There's Tamana, post-Canadian refit, looking very smart indeed with her new equipment. So the RNZN's current fleet is a reflection of Project Protector, 2 offshore patrol vessels, 2 Lake-class inshore patrol vessels, Canterbury, and with the helicopters and the landing craft. And of course, refueling, replenishment, heavy lift vessels with ice reinforcement for the Antarctic, Aotearoa, and the hydrographic dive support vessel, Manawanui, which is doing a great job. So those with the 2 Anzacs constitute the RNZN's current fleet. Unfortunately, like every other navy in the world which relies on volunteers, the RNZN is suffering from a lack of sailors, and it may be different now, but in 2023, the 2 offshore patrol vessels, Wellington and Otago, and the inshore patrol vessel, Hawea, were in a state of care and custody due to a lack of sailors to man them. This, unfortunately, is the situation we all find ourselves in with ships which are perfectly capable of being at sea, but don't have the ship's companies to take them there. There's been a huge cultural change in the RNZN over the years I've been describing to you, from those sailors blacking up to pretend to be Maori on board HMS New Zealand, a much more respectful and understanding relationship with the Maori world has developed. The RNZN has a long commitment to Maori culture and values, and that complements those customs inherited from the RN and adapted and maintained for more than a century. There is a Maori marae, a meeting place within Devonport's naval base. You can see some young female Maori sailors there, and you can see that CN and other senior officers wear a Maori cloak when they're on their official duties. And of course, Maori have always made up a large proportion of the lower deck in the RNZN, and some officers, and in recent years that has changed, and more we are seeing Maori senior officers, such as this 1-star Commodore Melissa Ross, promoted to Deputy Chief of Navy in 2019, and holding a Maori Mary there as a symbol of her authority. There's a sub-lieutenant there, Sub-Lieutenant Simeon, had a very troubled childhood, difficult childhood. She joined the RNZN as a communications sailor in 2011 and was commissioned as a maritime logistics officer, and her great-grandfather served in the cruiser HMNZS Leander. So that brings us more or less up to date. We're at Index. The RNZN claims to be, and I think has a good claim to be, the best small navy in the world. And that concludes my presentation.